The wind was bitter and sharp as the man made his way up the narrow, rocky path that led to the cabin. A thick fog clung to the mountainside, obscuring the jagged cliffs and making each step feel like a gamble. The trail was familiar, but the weight on his shoulders made it feel like a foreign journey. It had been a year since he'd left her here, alone. He pulled his coat tighter, his thoughts more haunting than the wind. He hadn't wanted to come back. In fact, he had delayed it as long as possible. But the letter from the village caretaker had been brief and to the point. His wife's last belongings were waiting for him, and it was time to claim them. The inheritance. He hated the word, but it was the only thing that pushed him forward now. The cabin finally appeared in the distance, nestled against the thick woods as if it had grown out of the very mountain itself. It was small, unassuming, and cold, just as he remembered. Each step toward the front door felt heavier, as if the air itself were resisting his arrival. He stopped just short of the door, his breath hanging in the frozen air, staring at the place he had left her to die. He remembered the last day he saw her, pale, frail, and too weak to speak. Her eyes had said everything. She had known he wouldn't stay. She had known he wouldn't wait for the end. And yet, even then, she hadn't begged him to. That silence had haunted him ever since. Now, as he stood on the threshold, it was as if the past was standing there, waiting to wrap around him like the cold. The door creaked open, and inside, the air was stale, untouched for months. But something was different. He could feel it in the way the hairs stood on the back of his neck. It wasn't just the silence. It was the sense that someone had been here. The cabin was as he had left it, at first glance. Dust covered the old wooden furniture, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. But the further he walked into the small space, the more he realized something was off. A coat hanging by the door, one he didn't recognize. A mug on the table, placed there as if someone had been sipping tea only moments ago. His heart began to race. He moved to the small bedroom where he had last seen her lying. The bed was made neatly, as if no one had ever occupied it. Yet he knew she had died here. His mind couldn't reconcile the image. He looked around, scanning the room for any clue, anything that could explain the eerie sense of intrusion. On the nightstand, he found something that hadn't been there before, a journal. It wasn't his wife's. He picked it up, feeling the weight of something unknown. The leather cover was smooth, worn from use, and when he opened it, the first page had a date that sent a chill down his spine. It was dated 3 days after he had left. He flipped through the pages, skimming the entries. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Whoever had written this had spent time here. But who? The entries were cryptic, speaking of long nights, conversations that didn't make sense, and watching over her. Watching over his wife. His hands trembled as he closed the journal, realizing that someone had been here, with her, after he had left. And he had never known. The thought consumed him. Someone else had been there in her final days. Someone who hadn't abandoned her. He stared at the journal, feeling a knot of guilt twist inside him. But who had written it? And why had they left it here for him to find? The journal weighed heavily in his pocket as the man made his way down the trail toward the village. His mind raced, trying to piece together who the mysterious visitor could have been. The thought of someone else being there with his wife gnawed at him, their presence a stark reminder of the role he had failed to play. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and now someone else had been there, silent, unseen, until now. The village was as he remembered, small, tucked away in the valley below the cabin. It was a place that seemed frozen in time, with its crooked houses and narrow streets. He had avoided speaking with the villagers back then, uninterested in their lives or their stories. But today, he needed answers. He approached the caretaker's house, a modest structure with smoke rising lazily from the chimney. The caretaker, an old man with a weathered face, greeted him at the door with a frown, as though he had expected this visit. "I got your letter," the man said, not bothering with pleasantries. He wanted to get straight to the point. "About my wife's belongings." The caretaker nodded, but didn't invite him in. "Yes, they've been waiting for you. It's been some time. Who else was there?" The words slipped out before he could stop them. He was supposed to ease into this, gather information carefully, but his need for the truth overrode any strategy. After I left, I found a journal. Someone else stayed with her. The caretaker's face didn't betray much, but his eyes darkened. Someone came to see her. Yes. The man's chest tightened. Who? That's not for me to say. The caretaker's response was quick, dismissive. Some things are better left alone, especially for men who have already left too much behind. The sharpness in his words stung. He felt anger rising, but it was dulled by the realization that he couldn't push too hard, not yet. The caretaker knew something, but he wouldn't reveal it easily. Why won't you tell me? He pressed, trying to keep his voice steady. Because some answers don't change anything, the caretaker said simply. She found peace in her final days, and that's what matters. The man clenched his jaw. Peace. The word felt like an accusation. If she had found peace, it had been in someone else's presence, not his. The caretaker's cryptic words only fueled his frustration. Back at the cabin, the journal rested on the table, as if it were waiting for him. The man paced the small room, his mind spinning with questions the caretaker had refused to answer. He felt trapped, both by the walls around him and the memories of the woman he had abandoned. His wife's death, once a distant and uncomfortable memory, was now a looming shadow that grew darker with each passing hour. He returned to the journal, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. The entries were sparse but deliberate, written with a care he hadn't expected. Each line spoke of small moments. Watching her sleep, reading to her, sitting by her side as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Whoever this person was, they had been with her during her final moments. Moments that should have been his to share. But it wasn't just the entries that unnerved him. It was the way they were written, as if the visitor had known her deeply, intimately. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some stranger. The familiarity in the writing suggested a connection, something more than just a passing visitor. As he read further, the dates began to align with his absence. The entries became more frequent as her health deteriorated, and then, abruptly, they stopped. The final entry was written on the day she died, and it chilled him to the bone. She's gone now, peaceful, but I will stay, if only to remember the quiet. He closed the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. Who was this person, and why had they stayed? Why hadn't they left when she passed? It made no sense, and yet the more he thought about it, the more it felt like this visitor had some kind of claim over her final days, something he had lost the right to when he left. As he sat in the silence of the cabin, the air felt thick with unanswered questions. His mind wandered to the caretaker's words. She found peace in her final days. But how could she have found peace without him? The wind howled outside, and the cold air seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. The man felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Someone had been here, and they had known her in ways he hadn't. The guilt that had lingered in the background now consumed him fully. The visitor had been there when he hadn't, and that truth was unbearable. He stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. The walls of the cabin felt as though they were closing in, suffocating him with their silence. He needed to find out who this person was and why they had been with his wife in her final days. He needed answers, even if he feared what they might reveal. The next few days passed in a blur of cold and isolation. The man found himself trapped in the cabin, both physically and mentally. Outside, the weather worsened, heavy clouds shrouding the mountain in a constant, eerie mist. The village below seemed further away than ever, and his thoughts of returning there for answers faded as the oppressive stillness of the cabin took hold. He avoided the bedroom where his wife had died, opting instead to sit by the fire in the main room, staring blankly into the flames. The journal remained on the table beside him, a constant reminder of the visitor who had been there with her in the end. Each time he glanced at it, a wave of guilt crashed over him. He had left her, and someone else had stepped in to fill the void. As the days stretched on, his mind wandered to darker places. He replayed the moments leading up to his departure from the cabin, the way his wife's eyes had looked at him, the silence that had followed him as he walked away. He had convinced himself at the time that he couldn't stay, that watching her die would be too painful. But now, with the cabin closing in on him, he wondered if that had been an excuse. Perhaps it hadn't been the pain he was avoiding, but the responsibility. The isolation wore on him. Each night, as the wind howled outside, he lay awake, plagued by thoughts of the visitor. Who were they? Why had they stayed? The more he thought about it, the more the questions consumed him. He imagined the visitor sitting where he now sat, tending to the fire, speaking to his wife in hushed tones while she lay in her bed. The image made his stomach churn with jealousy and regret. On the third night, he couldn't take it any longer. He needed to know. He grabbed the journal and flipped through the pages, reading the entries again with a feverish intensity. Each word felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The visitor had been there every day, watching over her, caring for her. There were even descriptions of her last breaths, something he hadn't been there to witness. She looked peaceful, the visitor had written in one of the final entries. She smiled at me, and I knew she was ready. The man closed the journal, his hands shaking. He had been absent for her final moments, and now it felt like the visitor had taken his place. Worse, it seemed as though his wife had welcomed this stranger's presence, finding comfort in their care. Was this the peace the caretaker had spoken of? Could she have truly been at peace, knowing he had abandoned her? The thought tormented him, eating away at whatever resolve he had left. He stood abruptly, knocking the journal to the floor. The walls of the cabin seemed to press in on him, the air thick and suffocating. His thoughts spiraled, fueled by the isolation and guilt that now clung to him like a second skin. He needed to escape, if only for a moment. But where would he go? He paced the room, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He wanted to confront the visitor, to demand answers, but the more he thought about it, the more he feared what he might learn. Who was this person, and what had they meant to his wife? The fire crackled quietly as the man sat down, his head in his hands. Memories of his wife came flooding back, small moments from their life together that he had tried to bury. He remembered when they first moved to the cabin, long before her illness, when things between them were still good. The mountains had seemed like an escape back then, a place where they could start fresh, away from the noise of their old life. But the peace they sought had never truly come. Over time, the silence between them grew heavier, filled with unspoken resentments and regrets. He had always been distant, focused on his own ambitions, and she had quietly suffered in his absence. Her illness had only made things worse, the strain of caring for her deepening the rift between them. He remembered the moment he had decided to leave. She had been too weak to speak, her body frail and trembling, but her eyes had been clear, and they had spoken volumes. He had convinced himself that she understood why he had to go, that she didn't want him to see her waste away. But now, sitting alone in the cabin where she had spent her final days, he wondered if that had been the truth, or if it was just another excuse. His guilt deepened as he realized how little he had truly known her. The journal had shown him a side of his wife that he had never seen, a woman who had found solace in the company of someone else. The visitor had provided the care and compassion that he had been too selfish to offer. A part of him wondered if she had ever truly forgiven him for leaving. The thought gnawed at him, making it difficult to breathe. He had come here for closure, to claim what he thought was his, but now he was left with nothing but questions. The visitor's presence in her life and her death had shattered whatever illusions he had clung to about their relationship. She had found peace, but it had been with someone else. And now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life he had failed to understand. Outside, the wind began to pick up, howling through the cracks in the cabin walls. The man stared into the fire, feeling the weight of his past pressing down on him. The truth was starting to become clear, though he still didn't want to face it. He had abandoned her, and in doing so, he had lost more than just the chance to say goodbye. He had lost the woman he once loved, and now, in this cold and empty cabin, he was beginning to realize that he might never find the peace he so desperately sought. The next morning, the man was driven by an urgency he could no longer suppress. The visitor's presence, their cryptic words in the journal, and the growing realization of how little he had known about his wife's final days all weighed heavily on him. He needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them, the caretaker. The village was a ghost town that morning, shrouded in fog. The man walked with purpose, his footsteps muffled by the thick mist that seemed to cling to everything. When he arrived at the caretaker's house, he didn't hesitate. He pounded on the door, each knock echoing through the quiet street. The caretaker opened the door slowly, his face creased with the same indifferent expression he had worn during their previous encounter. But this time, the man wasn't going to leave without answers. "I need to know who the visitor was," the man said, his voice low and hard. "You know, and I want the truth." The caretaker looked at him, his eyes studying the man's face as though weighing whether or not to divulge the secret he'd kept. The silence stretched between them, tense and uncomfortable, until the caretaker finally stepped aside, gesturing for the man to come in. Inside, the caretaker's home was sparse, with only the essentials: a chair, a table, a fireplace barely smoldering. The caretaker motioned to the chair, and the man sat down, feeling the weight of what was to come pressing in on him. "You won't like what you hear," the caretaker began, his voice gruff. "Some truths are better left buried. I can't live with this uncertainty," the man replied, his voice tight with frustration. "Who was the visitor?" The caretaker sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face before speaking. "She knew him, long before she ever met you." The man's heart sank. "Who?" The caretaker met his gaze, unflinching. "An old lover, from before she married you. He found her when she was sick, came to say goodbye, but he stayed. She asked him to." The words hit the man like a punch to the gut. An old lover. The visitor hadn't been some stranger or a kind-hearted soul offering comfort to a dying woman. He had been someone from her past, someone she had loved, and she had asked him to stay. She wanted to see him again, the caretaker continued, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "He gave her peace when you couldn't. She forgave you, but in her last days, it was him she wanted near." The man's chest tightened as the truth settled over him like a heavy fog. The visitor hadn't been there by accident. His wife had chosen him, chosen someone else over him in her final moments. It wasn't just the guilt of abandoning her that weighed on him now. It was the realization that he had never been the one to truly understand her, to be what she needed. "She found peace," the caretaker said, softer now, as if sensing the man's inner turmoil. "That's what you need to focus on." But the man couldn't focus on that. All he could think about was how he had failed her. Even in her death, he hadn't been the one to give her what she needed most. His wife had found peace, yes, but not with him. And the ache of that realization was more than he could bear. Back in the cabin, the man sat in front of the fire, staring blankly at the journal in his hands. The caretaker's words echoed in his mind. An old lover. She asked him to stay. He flipped the journal open again, his eyes scanning the pages, now with a deeper understanding of the words written within. The entries had once seemed cryptic, almost cold, but now they took on a new meaning. Each line spoke of moments spent together, not just in physical proximity, but in emotional intimacy. The visitor had known her before the illness, before she had become the fragile figure the man had left behind. And in those final days, she had turned to that past for comfort. She smiled today. One entry read, "It was small, but I could tell it was real. I held her hand as the sun set, and for a moment, it felt like time had rewound itself. We were young again, laughing under the trees." The man's throat tightened as he read the words. His wife had found solace not in the life they had built together, but in the life she had lived before him. And the visitor had been there, giving her the peace and comfort he never could. Another entry caught his eye, written just days before she passed. She talks about him sometimes, about how she hopes he's all right, about how she wishes things had been different. She forgives him. She always did, but she knows he wouldn't have stayed. The man's hands trembled as he read the words. His wife had forgiven him, but she had known, even in her final moments, that he wouldn't have stayed. The guilt that had gnawed at him for so long was now compounded by the realization that she had been right. He closed the journal, unable to read any further. The truth was clearer now than ever. He had never truly been what she needed, and in her final moments, she had turned to someone who could give her the peace he couldn't. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on him with the weight of his failure. His wife had found peace with another man, and he had been too blind, too selfish, to see that she had needed something more than what he had offered. The journal sat on the table, a reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had failed to be. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the cabin, as the man sat in silence, grappling with the truth he had fought so hard to avoid. The days passed slowly in the cabin, but time seemed to have lost all meaning for the man. The revelation of the visitor's identity, an old lover, someone his wife had trusted and cared for more deeply than him, gnawed at him constantly. He felt hollow, as though the truth had carved out everything inside him, leaving only guilt and regret. Outside, the weather had turned harsh, with the wind howling through the cracks in the cabin walls. It was as if the mountain itself was reacting to his inner turmoil, mirroring the storm raging in his mind. The fog, thick and unrelenting, made it impossible to see beyond the window. The world outside felt as distant and unreachable as his wife's forgiveness. He spent hours by the fire, staring into the flames as memories of his past mistakes swirled around him. He had always been selfish, putting his own needs and ambitions above everything else. Even when his wife had fallen ill, he hadn't stayed, convincing himself that she didn't need him. But that had been a lie. She had needed him, and in her final moments, she had turned to someone who had truly cared for her. The visitor had stayed, something the man had been too afraid to do. The journal sat on the table, untouched for days. He couldn't bring himself to read more of it, to uncover more details about the relationship his wife had with the visitor. Each word felt like a dagger, and he was already bleeding enough. On the fifth night, the storm outside grew louder, the wind battering the walls of the cabin with an almost violent force. The man sat in the darkness, the fire having long since gone out, his mind spiraling further into despair. His thoughts became jumbled, and the weight of his failures pressed down on him until he felt like he could hardly breathe. His wife's face appeared before him in the shadows of the room, her eyes full of disappointment, her lips mouthing words he couldn't hear. He tried to speak to her, to apologize, but his throat was dry, and no sound came out. The guilt overwhelmed him, and he sank to the floor, his body trembling as he sobbed in silence. The cabin had become a prison, trapping him not only physically but emotionally as well. He had come here seeking closure, but all he had found was a mirror reflecting his own shortcomings. He had failed her, failed their marriage, and now, in her death, he had lost the chance to make things right. The wind howled again, louder this time, rattling the windows with a force that made the man look up. In that moment, something shifted in the room. The shadows seemed to move, to take shape. He blinked, his vision blurred by tears, but when he wiped them away, he saw her. She stood in the corner of the room, just as she had looked before the illness took her, young, vibrant, and full of life. Her eyes were on him, and in them, he saw a sadness that cut him to his core. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." But she didn't respond. Instead, she turned away, fading into the darkness as quickly as she had appeared, leaving him alone once again. The man slumped against the wall, his body drained of energy. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, everything was still. He closed his eyes, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he had lost her long before she had died. The morning after the storm, the man woke to an eerie calm. The wind had died down, and the fog had lifted, revealing the stark, barren landscape around the cabin. The quiet felt oppressive, a reminder of a silence that now permeated his life. He had spent the night in emotional turmoil, but today, something felt different. He stood by the window, staring out at the desolate view. He hadn't planned on leaving the cabin just yet. There was still too much he didn't understand. He needed to know more about the visitor, more about the relationship that had bloomed between this man and his wife, while he had been absent. The journal had hinted at it, but the caretaker had confirmed the truth. His wife had turned to an old lover in her final days. Determined, the man left the cabin and walked the now-cleared path back to the village. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. He was focused on one thing: finding the truth. He needed to speak to the caretaker again, needed more answers. When he arrived at the caretaker's house, he found the old man sitting on his porch, smoking a pipe as if the storm had never happened. The man approached, his steps heavy with the weight of the questions still unanswered. "I need to know more," he said, his voice hoarse from the night before. About him, about what he meant to her. The caretaker took a long drag from his pipe, exhaling a plume of smoke before speaking. "He meant more to her than you ever realized, more than you could have understood." The word stung, but the man didn't flinch. He had already come to terms with the fact that his wife had loved someone else, even if he hadn't fully accepted it yet. "Who was he?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did they have?" The caretaker sighed, his weathered face showing the weight of the years and the secrets he had kept. "They were young once, before she met you. They were in love, or at least something close to it. But life happened, and they drifted apart. She moved on, married you, but he never forgot her. And when he heard she was dying, he came back." The man's chest tightened. The idea that his wife had loved another man before him wasn't surprising, but knowing that this man had returned to her, had been there for her when he hadn't, made the guilt even worse. "Did she love him?" the man asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The caretaker looked at him with pity in his eyes. "Yes, she did." The man felt the ground shift beneath him. His wife had loved this man, had turned to him in her final moments, and had found peace with him. It was a truth that cut deeper than any physical pain he had ever experienced. The caretaker stood up, his pipe still in hand, and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "She forgave you," he said softly. "She always did. But sometimes, forgiveness isn't enough to erase the past." The man nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. He had spent so long trying to find closure, but now that he had the truth, he wasn't sure what to do with it. As the man walked back to the cabin from the village, the sky began to darken, signaling the arrival of another storm. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He quickened his pace, determined to get back before the storm hit, though part of him wondered if the storm inside him was far worse than anything nature could throw at him. By the time he reached the cabin, the first drops of rain had started to fall, hitting the ground with a steady, relentless rhythm. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, making the old cabin creak under the pressure. He stepped inside and shut the door, but the sound of the storm was unavoidable. It pressed in on him, the howling wind matching the turmoil in his mind. He stood in the center of the room, listening to the rain batter the roof, feeling the familiar sense of isolation closing in. It had been days since the caretaker had revealed the truth about the visitor and his wife's relationship, but the man still couldn't fully process it. Every time he thought about it, the weight of it threatened to pull him under. The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows, and the man's thoughts followed suit. He couldn't help but replay the caretaker's words over and over in his mind. She loved him. The truth stung, gnawing at him in the way only regret could. His wife had loved someone else, and in the end, that man had been there for her in ways he never had. As the storm raged outside, the man moved to the fireplace, lighting the logs that had been stacked there. The fire caught quickly, its warmth spreading through the small room, but even the heat couldn't thaw the coldness that had settled deep inside him. He sat down in front of the fire, the journal once again in his hands, though he had no intention of reading it tonight. He simply held it, the weight of the visitor's words heavy in his grasp. The storm grew fiercer, lightning flashing outside the window, illuminating the cabin in brief, eerie bursts of light. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin, as though the earth itself was angry at him for abandoning his wife, for not being there when she needed him most. And maybe the earth had every right to be angry. For a long time, he sat in silence, listening to the storm, lost in his own self-loathing. He had spent so long thinking that he could find peace, that returning to the cabin would give him the closure he so desperately sought. But now he realized that peace was unattainable. Not for him, not after everything he had done. The fire crackled, the sound barely audible over the roar of the storm, and the man closed his eyes, trying to block out the world. But even in the darkness, behind his eyelids, he saw her, his wife. Her face was clear, more vivid than it had been in years. He could see the sadness in her eyes, the disappointment, the forgiveness she had given so freely even though he hadn't deserved it. He felt his chest tighten, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the guilt overwhelmed him once again. He couldn't escape it, no matter how hard he tried. His wife had found peace, but he never would. A loud crash outside startled him, pulling him from his thoughts. He stood quickly, his heart racing as he moved to the window. The storm was at its peak now, the rain pouring down in sheets, the wind bending the trees nearly in half. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of light, he thought he saw something, someone moving outside. He blinked, shaking his head. It was impossible. The storm was too violent for anyone to be out there. But as another bolt of lightning lit up the sky, he saw it again. A figure moving through the trees, heading toward the cabin. Panic surged through him as he backed away from the window, his mind racing. Who could it be? Was it the caretaker? Or was it someone else? Was it him? The visitor? The man's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the door, waiting, the journal still clutched tightly in his hands. The storm raged on, and for a moment, the only sound was the relentless pounding of the rain. But then, over the noise of the storm, he heard it, the creak of the front steps. Someone was outside. The sound of the front steps creaking sent a chill down the man's spine. He stood frozen, his mind torn between disbelief and the gut-wrenching fear that the visitor had returned. His breath caught in his throat as he waited, listening for any further sign of movement. Then came the knock, a single, deliberate knock on the door. It was barely audible over the howling wind and rain, but it was enough to send his heart racing. For a moment, he considered not answering, considered staying hidden inside the cabin until the storm passed. But the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Whoever was out there wasn't going to leave without being acknowledged. Slowly, the man moved toward the door, each step heavier than the last. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob, and for a moment he hesitated. What if it was him? The visitor, the man who had been with his wife in her final days. What would he say? What could he say? With a deep breath, he turned the knob and pulled the door open. Standing there, soaked to the bone, was a man. He was tall, with graying hair and a face lined with years of experience. His eyes, sharp and focused, locked onto the man standing in the doorway. The man's heart sank as he realized who he was looking at. It was him, the visitor, the man who had been with his wife. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," the visitor said, his voice steady despite the storm raging behind him. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shaking the rain from his coat as he glanced around the cabin. It's been a long time. The man didn't know what to say. His mind was a whirl of emotions, anger, guilt, confusion. He wanted to demand answers, to ask why the visitor had stayed with his wife, why she had chosen him in her final days. But all he could manage was a quiet, "Why are you here?" The visitor set his coat down on the chair by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting long shadows across the room. "I figured it was time we talked," he said, turning to face the man. "There's a lot you don't understand, a lot you need to know." The man's jaw tightened. "I already know everything. She loved you. She wanted you here, not me." The visitor's expression softened, and for a moment, the man saw something in his eyes, something that wasn't anger or triumph, but sadness. "It's not as simple as that," the visitor said quietly. "She loved you too. She just needed someone else in the end, someone who could give her the kind of peace she couldn't find with you." The man clenched his fists, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "I was her husband," he said, his voice shaking. "I should have been the one with her. I should have." "You weren't ready," the visitor interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "And she knew that. She forgave you for leaving. She always forgave you. But in the end, she needed more than just forgiveness. She needed closure. That's why I stayed." The words hit the man like a physical blow, and he staggered back, feeling the weight of them settle deep in his chest. He had spent so long trying to come to terms with his guilt, but now he realized that his wife had already made peace with it long before she died. The visitor watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. "She wanted you to know that she was at peace when she passed," he said softly. "That's why I came back, to tell you that, to help you find the peace she wanted you to have." The man felt his knees weaken, and he sank into the chair by the fire, his head in his hands. The visitor's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to truly grieve. For his wife, for the life they had shared, for the man he had failed to be. The cabin was silent after the visitor's words, except for the steady crackling of the fire. The man sat in the chair, his head heavy with the weight of everything he had learned. The visitor had come not to claim something for himself, but to offer the peace his wife had found before her death, peace the man had been too blind to see. The visitor stood by the fire, his face calm but unreadable, waiting for the man to speak. But what could he say? His wife had forgiven him. The visitor had stayed to help her find peace. And now he was left with the crushing reality that he had spent so long running from his own guilt that he had never truly grieved for her. "I don't know what to do," the man finally whispered, his voice broken. He had come to the cabin for closure, for answers, but now that he had them, he was more lost than ever. The visitor turned to him, his gaze steady. "You move forward," he said softly. "You let go of the past. You make peace with yourself, just like she did." The man shook his head, his throat tight with emotion. I can't just let it go. Not after everything." The visitor nodded, as if he had expected this response. "Then don't let it go," he said, "but let it guide you. She wanted you to find peace, not for her sake, but for yours. She knew you'd carry this guilt, but you don't have to. It's a choice." The man stared into the fire, the flames flickering and casting long shadows across the room. He thought about everything he had done, every moment he had walked away from her, every time he had convinced himself that leaving was easier than staying. The truth was, he had been a coward. He had abandoned a woman he loved because he was too afraid to watch her die. But now, after everything, he realized that leaving hadn't made things easier. It had only made the guilt heavier, the loss deeper. His wife had forgiven him, and in her final moments, she had found peace with the man she had once loved. And now, it was up to him to decide whether he would carry his guilt for the rest of his life, or if he would let it shape him into someone better. He looked at the visitor, his mind made up. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The visitor smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of understanding and compassion. "You honor her," he said simply. "You take what she left behind and you make something good of it. For her, for you." The man nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling in his chest. It was time to let go of the past, not to forget it, but to move forward, carrying the memory of his wife with him, but no longer shackled by the guilt of his actions. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clear. The man stepped outside the cabin, taking a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. For the first time in years, he felt lighter, as if the burden he had been carrying for so long had finally begun to lift. He had spent the night thinking about the visitor's words, about his wife's forgiveness, and about the choices that lay ahead of him. He couldn't change the past, but he could decide what to do with the future. And now, he knew what he had to do. With a renewed sense of purpose, he walked down the path toward the village, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the ground. When he reached the caretaker's house, he knocked on the door, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. The caretaker opened the door, his expression wary. "Back again?" he asked. The man nodded, his voice steady. "I need to finalize my wife's estate. I've decided to leave it to the village. The caretaker blinked, clearly surprised. The whole estate? You're sure about that? Yes, the man replied, his voice firm. It's what she would have wanted, and it's what I need to do. The caretaker studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're doing the right thing, he said. She would have been proud. The man smiled, a small but genuine smile, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that truly honored his wife's memory. He wasn't running from his guilt anymore. He was using it to make a difference, to bring some good into the world in her name. As he left the caretaker's house, the sun fully rose, bathing the village in warm light. The man felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace that had eluded him for so long. His wife had found her peace before she died, and now he was finally finding his own. He made his way back up the mountain, the familiar path no longer filled with the same dread and isolation. The cabin stood as it always had, but now it was no longer a place of guilt and regret. It was a place of remembrance, a place where he had come to terms with his past and found the strength to move forward. He stood at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the vast expanse of the valley below. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. And in that moment, he knew that he had made the right choice. His wife was gone, but her memory would live on, not just in the things she had left behind, but in the way he chose to carry that memory with him. The guilt was still there, but it no longer consumed him. It was part of him, part of his story, but it no longer defined him. As the wind swept across the mountain, the man closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. For the first time in years, he felt free. The following weeks passed in a blur of quiet reflection and change. The man spent most of his days walking the trails around the village and tending to the cabin. He had grown used to the solitude, but it no longer weighed on him in the same way it once had. Now, the silence felt like an old friend, allowing him to think without the oppressive burden of guilt hanging over him. He had spoken to the villagers and arranged for the donation of his wife's estate. The village was small, its people struggling to keep up with the demands of the modern world. His wife's inheritance would help build a new community center, a place for the villagers to gather, to share stories, and to pass down traditions to the younger generation. It was a project that would honor her memory far better than any material possession ever could. As he worked through the paperwork and logistics, the man felt a growing sense of purpose. It wasn't just about giving back, it was about moving forward. His wife had forgiven him long ago, and now he was finally beginning to forgive himself. There was no going back to the past, no undoing the mistakes he had made, but there was a future that could be shaped by the lessons he had learned. One afternoon, as he stood outside the cabin looking out over the valley, the visitor appeared again. This time, his presence didn't stir the same feelings of anger or guilt that had plagued the man before. Instead, it felt like the quiet end of something that had once held too much power over him. The visitor approached with the same calm demeanor as before, but there was something different about the way he carried himself, lighter, as if his role in the story was coming to a close. "It's done," the man said quietly, nodding toward the village below. "The estate will go to the people who need it." The visitor smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "She'd be proud of you for that." The man nodded, feeling the truth in those words. He had spent so long running from the idea of pride, believing that he hadn't earned it. But now, as he stood on this mountain, having finally come to terms with his past, he realized that pride wasn't about being perfect. It was about making peace with your flaws, accepting them, and doing better. "I think I'm ready to leave," the man said, his voice steady. The visitor raised an eyebrow. "Leave?" "Not just the cabin," the man clarified. "The guilt, the pain, all of it. I think it's time I let it go." The visitor nodded. "It's a good choice." They stood in silence for a while, the wind rustling through the trees as the sun began its slow descent in the sky. The visitor seemed content, as if his role had been fulfilled, and the man felt the same sense of finality settling over him. It wasn't an ending, just a new beginning. "What will you do now?" the visitor asked after a long pause. The man shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I don't know yet. But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? The future is open now. The visitor clapped a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. Good luck, my friend. With that, the visitor turned and walked away, disappearing down the mountain path, leaving the man alone at the edge of the cliff. But this time, the solitude didn't feel lonely. It felt like freedom. Months later, the village had already begun to transform. The new community center was being built with funds from the man's donation, and the villagers had welcomed the project with open arms. The man, now living in a small house at the base of the mountain, had found peace in the simple life he had created for himself. He spent his days helping with the construction of the center, planting trees around the village, and joining the community for evening gatherings. The villagers no longer saw him as the outsider who had come to claim his wife's estate. He had become one of them, a part of their world, and in return, they had given him a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden light over the village, the man sat on the porch of his small house, watching the world go by. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't haunted by memories of his wife, of the choices he had made, or of the guilt that had once consumed him. Instead, he was content. The man had found peace, not because he had forgotten the past, but because he had learned to live with it. He had accepted his mistakes, made amends, and honored his wife's memory in a way that truly mattered. And now, as the wind carried the scent of pine and earth through the air, he knew that he was finally free. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to appear, one by one, in the clear night sky. The man leaned back in his chair, a soft smile on his face as he looked up at the stars. And for the first time in years, he felt a home. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our work. We'd love to hear from you. What part of the story had the most impact on you? Let us know in the comments below. Also, if you have any suggestions for future stories you'd like to see on the channel, feel free to drop your ideas. Your input helps us create content that truly resonates with you. See you in the next story.